Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now let's start. Vienna, 1848. The scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air. The Habsburg Empire teetered on the brink of dissolution as revolutionary fervor swept through its territories. Emperor Ferdinand I, weakened by illness and the growing discontent of his subjects, had abdicated in favor of his young nephew, Franz Josef. At 18, the new emperor inherited not only a fractured empire, but also the monumental task of quelling the rebellions that threatened to tear it apart. In the ancient kingdom of Bohemia, one of the jewels in the Habsburg crown, the nobility faced a difficult choice: join the revolution and risk everything, or pledge loyalty to the young emperor and salvage what remained of their status and lands. Count Zdenek of the illustrious Zima family chose a third path, one that would secure his family's future while demonstrating his allegiance to the crown. "Florence, my dear daughter, you must understand the gravity of our situation," Count Zima said, his voice gentle but firm as he stood in his daughter's chamber at their estate near Prague. Florence Zima looked up from her book, her dark eyes questioning. At 22, she possessed both beauty and intellect, gifts that had drawn numerous suitors to their door in better times. But these were not better times. "Father, what troubles you?" she asked, marking her place in the volume of poetry she had been reading. The count sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping beneath the weight of his decision. "The new emperor has requested that noble families from each province send representatives to Vienna, ostensibly as members of his advisory council, but in truth, as hostages," Florence finished for him, her voice steady despite the cold dread that settled in her stomach. "As guarantors of loyalty," her father corrected, though they both understood the truth. "I have been asked to send someone from our family." Florence set her book aside and rose to her feet. "And you have chosen me." It wasn't a question. As the eldest of 3 daughters, with no brothers to bear the family burden, Florence had always known that duty would eventually call her away from the safety of their ancestral home. "The imperial court will provide certain advantages," the count said, his eyes not meeting hers. "You will have access to society that even our family cannot provide. And perhaps I might catch the eye of a suitable husband." Florence completed his thought with a sad smile. "One with enough influence to protect our family's interests." The count nodded, relieved that she understood without requiring him to speak the mercenary truth aloud. "The imperial household awaits your arrival within the fortnight. I've already begun preparations for your journey." Florence turned to the window, gazing out at the rolling Bohemian countryside she had known all her life. Spring was just beginning to touch the landscape with green. Would she ever see it in full bloom again? "I will do my duty, father," she said softly. "For our family. For Bohemia." What remained unspoken between them was the knowledge that she was being sent as a sacrifice on the altar of politics. A beautiful, educated young woman dispatched to a volatile court where her very presence would serve as surety for her family's good behavior during these tumultuous times. The journey to Vienna took 4 days by carriage. Florence spent most of it watching the landscape change from the familiar hills of Bohemia to the plains of Moravia, and finally to the grand approaches to the imperial capital. Her lady's maid, Margit, chattered nervously beside her, but Florence barely heard her. Her mind was occupied with preparation for what lay ahead. Vienna itself took her breath away. Though she had visited once as a child, the city had transformed in the years since. The medieval walls were being demolished to make way for the grand Ringstrasse boulevard the young emperor had envisioned. Construction dust mingled with the smoke from factory chimneys and the steam of locomotives, all signs of an empire lurching toward modernity even as it fought to maintain its traditions. The Hofburg Palace loomed before them, a sprawling complex of buildings that had grown over centuries to house the Habsburg monarchy. Florence felt herself shrink in the shadow of its imposing facade. "Remember who you are," she whispered to herself as the carriage came to a stop in the palace courtyard. A daughter of Bohemia, a Zima. Court life enveloped Florence like a silken web. The first weeks passed in a blur of introductions, protocols, and carefully orchestrated social events. She was assigned quarters in a wing reserved for the imperial guests, a polite term for the nobles from restive provinces whose presence ensured their families' continued loyalty. She quickly learned the rhythms of the Hofburg. Emperor Franz Josef was a creature of habit, rising before dawn and working methodically through mountains of paperwork before attending to the business of state. He appeared at formal functions with military precision, his young face already set in serious lines that belied his 18 years. Xavier Dankworth, the emperor's English-born private secretary, was often at his side, a tall, stern figure with penetrating gray eyes that seemed to assess the worth and loyalty of everyone they fell upon. Florence found herself subjected to that measuring gaze more than once, and each time it sent an uncomfortable shiver down her spine. "His Imperial Majesty works 18 hours a day," said Countess Esterhazy, one of the emperor's Hungarian guests who had taken Florence under her wing. "They say he barely sleeps, barely eats. The empire's troubles weigh on him constantly. A conscientious ruler is a blessing," Florence replied carefully, aware that every word spoken at court might find its way to unfriendly ears. "Indeed," the countess said with a knowing smile, though perhaps a ruler who occasionally smiled might inspire more confidence than one who approaches governance like a military campaign. Florence nodded noncommittally. She had only glimpsed the emperor from a distance during formal court functions. He seemed remote, unapproachable, a young man with old eyes, carrying the weight of an empire on shoulders that had barely finished growing. It was on her third week at court that Florence had her first direct encounter with Xavier Dankworth. She had discovered the palace library, a magnificent chamber filled with volumes collected over centuries by Habsburg monarchs. Finding a quiet corner, she had settled in with a book of Goethe's poetry, seeking comfort in the familiar verses. "The Imperial Library is not generally open to guests without permission," a cool voice interrupted her reading. Florence looked up to find Xavier Dankworth standing before her, tall and imposing in his severe black coat. His English heritage was evident in his accent, though years at the Habsburg court had softened its edges. "Forgive me," Florence said, rising quickly and marking her place in the book. "I wasn't aware. I'll leave immediately." "Goethe," Xavier observed, noticing the volume in her hands. "An interesting choice. Most ladies of the court prefer more frivolous reading." There was something in his tone, not quite mockery, but close enough to make Florence bristle. "I find that poetry speaks truths that mere conversation cannot," she replied. "Besides, my father believes that an educated mind is as important as a pleasing appearance." "Your father is Count Zima of Bohemia," Xavier said. It wasn't a question. His loyalty to the crown has been noted. "My presence here should attest to that loyalty," Florence said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, perhaps surprise at her candor. "I'll arrange for you to have proper access to the library," he said after a moment. "It would be a shame to deny books to someone who actually appreciates them." With that, he turned and left, leaving Florence to wonder at the strange encounter. True to his word, the following day a formal permission arrived, granting Florence access to the Imperial Library. She found herself returning frequently, drawn not only to the books but to the peaceful atmosphere that offered respite from the constant scrutiny of court life. It was there, amid the leather-bound volumes and the scent of paper and ink, that she encountered Xavier Dankworth again, and then again. Each time, their conversations grew longer, ranging from literature to music to the more cautious territory of politics. "You speak your mind more freely than most at court," Xavier observed one afternoon as they discussed a volume of English poetry he had recommended to her. "Perhaps that is the privilege of being a hostage," Florence replied. "What more can be taken from me?" Xavier's expression darkened. "Is that how you see yourself? As a hostage?" Florence looked away. "What else would you call it when noble families must send their daughters and sons to court as guarantors of good behavior?" "I would call it an ancient tradition of fostering cooperation between the crown and its domains," Xavier replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. "A pretty euphemism," Florence said with a small smile. "But the bars of a gilded cage are still bars." Xavier studied her for a long moment. "The emperor believes these measures are necessary to stabilize the empire after the revolutions. Too much blood has been shed already. And does the emperor ever question whether these measures might create as much resentment as they prevent?" Xavier's eyes widened slightly at her boldness. "You should be careful with such questions, Lady Zima. Others at court might interpret them less charitably than I do." And how do you interpret them, Mr. Dankworth? As the honest inquiries of a thoughtful mind, he said after a pause. A rare quality in any court, let alone one as complicated as ours. Their conversations continued over the following weeks, always in the library, always ostensibly about books or art. But beneath the surface ran currents of deeper understanding. Florence learned that Xavier had come to Vienna as a young man, the second son of a minor English nobleman, seeking opportunity in diplomatic service. His intelligence and discretion had caught the attention of the Habsburg court, and when the young Franz Josef ascended the throne, Xavier had been appointed to his personal staff. He is not what people think, Xavier said one day, speaking of the emperor in a rare moment of candor. The public sees the stern face, the military bearing. They don't see how deeply he cares for the empire, how personally he takes each decision. It must be a terrible burden, Florence said, to have so many lives depending on your choices. It is, Xavier agreed. And he bears it alone. As do you, in your way, Florence observed. I've noticed how the other courtiers defer to you, how they seek your favor to reach the emperor. Xavier looked surprised. You notice a great deal, Lady Zima. When one is sent to court as a sacrifice, one learns to observe, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Xavier's face tightened. You use that word again. Sacrifice. What would you call it? He had no answer for her. Spring gave way to summer, and Vienna sweltered under unusual heat. The court retreated to Schönbrunn Palace outside the city, where gardens and fountains offered some relief from the oppressive temperatures. Florence found the change welcome. The summer palace felt less confining than the Hofburg, with its extensive grounds providing space for solitary walks. It was during one such walk that she encountered the emperor himself. She had found a secluded bench in a less frequented part of the gardens, beneath the shade of an ancient linden tree. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the approaching figure until a shadow fell across her book. Florence looked up, startled, and immediately rose to her feet when she recognized Franz Josef. He was alone, an unusual circumstance for the monarch, who was typically surrounded by advisors or guards. Your Majesty, she said, dropping into a deep curtsy. Please, sit, the emperor said, gesturing to the bench. His German carried the distinctive Austrian accent of the Habsburg family. I didn't mean to disturb your reading. Florence resumed her seat, her heart pounding as the young ruler sat beside her, maintaining a proper distance. You are Lady Zima of Bohemia, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Your Majesty. Xavier Dankworth speaks highly of your intelligence, the emperor continued, surprising her. He says you have a unique perspective on matters of state. Florence felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Dankworth is too generous in his assessment, Your Majesty. I find he is rarely wrong in his judgments of character, Franz Josef replied. He looked tired, Florence thought, the dark circles under his eyes telling of sleepless nights spent working. Tell me, how do you find life at court? The directness of the question caught her off guard. Court etiquette dictated bland pleasantries, not honesty. But something in the emperor's gaze, a genuine interest, perhaps, or simply weariness with the constant dissembling of courtiers, prompted her to speak truthfully. I find it beautiful and suffocating in equal measure, Your Majesty, she said. The splendor is undeniable, but so is the knowledge that my presence here serves as a reminder to my family of what they stand to lose. She expected anger or dismissal. Instead, the emperor nodded slowly. Direct and honest, he murmured, just as Xavier said. He looked out across the gardens. Do you know, Lady Zima, that sometimes I envy the simplest gardener here at Schönbrunn? His responsibilities extend no further than the beds he tends. Mine encompass millions of lives across a dozen nations. The vulnerability in his voice touched something in Florence. For a moment, she saw not the emperor but the young man, only 4 years younger than herself, crushed beneath the weight of an inheritance he had never sought. Perhaps that is why gardens exist, Your Majesty, she said softly, to remind us that even the most elaborate creations require patience, care, and the wisdom to know when to prune and when to let grow. Franz Josef turned to her, surprise evident in his features. You have an unusual mind, Lady Zima. My father believed that daughters should be educated as thoroughly as sons, she replied. A progressive view, the emperor said, and one I might share, though many at court would consider it radical. He stood abruptly. I have taken enough of your time, but I would be interested to hear more of your thoughts on gardening in the future. With that, he departed, leaving Florence to wonder at the strange encounter. Only later would she realize that their conversation had been observed from a distance by Xavier Dankworth, his expression unreadable as he watched the emperor walk away. That evening, a note arrived at Florence's quarters, delivered by a palace footman. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message brief, * the butterfly house. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. * It wasn't signed, but Florence knew instinctively that it came from Xavier. The butterfly house was a secluded structure in the Schönbrunn Gardens, a glass pavilion where exotic butterflies were kept for the imperial family's enjoyment. She arrived precisely at 2, having managed to slip away from her lady's companion with a plea of a headache. The butterfly house was humid and filled with the fluttering of delicate wings. Xavier stood by a central fountain, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. Mr. Dankworth, Florence said, announcing her presence. He turned, and she was struck by the intensity in his gray eyes. Lady Zima, thank you for coming. Your note was intriguing, if cryptic, she replied, moving to stand beside him. A blue butterfly landed briefly on her sleeve before fluttering away. I saw you speaking with the emperor yesterday, Xavier said without preamble. What did he say to you? The directness of the question surprised her. We spoke of gardens, she said carefully, and the burdens of responsibility. Xavier's eyes narrowed slightly. Gardens. It was a metaphor, Florence explained. For governance, I believe. And did he ask you anything specific? About Bohemia, perhaps? About your father's loyalties? Florence felt a flash of indignation. No. Our conversation was philosophical, not political. She studied him closely. Why are you asking these questions, Mr. Dankworth? Are you concerned about what I might have said to His Majesty? Xavier ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration she had never seen from him before. I am concerned about the emperor becoming too interested in you. The implication hung in the air between them. I assure you, there was nothing improper in our conversation, Florence said stiffly. That isn't what concerns me, Xavier replied, his voice dropping lower. What concerns me is that Franz Josef has lived his entire life according to protocol and duty. He has never shown interest in any woman outside of the prescribed diplomatic introductions to potential Habsburg brides. Yet yesterday he sought you out, alone, and spoke to you with a candor he rarely shows even to his closest advisors. Florence felt her pulse quicken. I'm sure you're mistaken about his interest. It was a chance encounter, nothing more. It wasn't chance, Xavier said. He asked about you after seeing us in the library together. He had you pointed out to him at court functions. And yesterday, he deliberately walked to that part of the garden because he knew you took daily readings there. Florence stared at him, processing this information. Why are you telling me this? Xavier stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. Because it places you in danger, Florence. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent an unexpected thrill through her. What danger could come from an emperor's interest? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The kind that comes from placing yourself between rival court factions, Xavier said grimly. The Habsburg dynasty has marriage plans for Franz Josef, alliances that have been years in the making. If he shows favor to a Bohemian countess, particularly one whose family has questionable revolutionary sympathies. My family has no revolutionary sympathies, Florence protested. That doesn't matter, Xavier said. What matters is perception. And the perception would be that a provincial noble family is trying to curry imperial favor through their daughter. Florence felt anger rise in her chest. So I am damned either way. Sent here as a hostage to ensure my family's good behavior, yet condemned if the emperor shows me the slightest kindness. I'm trying to protect you, Xavier said, his voice softening. Why? Florence demanded. What am I to you, Mr. Dankworth, that you would concern yourself with my welfare? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Xavier's gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest moment before returning to her eyes. You are someone I have come to respect, he said finally. Someone whose mind I value. I would not see you become a casualty of court intrigue. It wasn't the whole truth. Florence could see that in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes as he spoke. But it was as much as either of them could acknowledge in their positions. What would you have me do? She asked. Refuse if the emperor speaks to me again? That would be treason. No, Xavier said. But be careful. Give him no reason to single you out. And if he does approach you again, keep your conversations to safe topics. Literature. Music. Nothing that could be construed as political influence. Florence nodded slowly. And if he asks about Bohemia? About my family? Then you must answer truthfully but cautiously, Xavier advised. The emperor values honesty. It's rare enough in his world. But remember that your words carry weight not just for yourself, but for your family and province. As they left the butterfly house separately to avoid notice, Florence couldn't help but wonder at the complex web she had unwittingly entered. She had been sent to Vienna as a hostage, a sacrifice to secure her family's position. Now she found herself navigating not only the perilous waters of court politics, but also the unexpected current of attraction to a man whose duty placed him perpetually beyond her reach. Summer waned, and with autumn's approach came preparations for the court's return to the Habsburg. Florence found herself dreading the move. At Schönbrunn, she had found pockets of solitude, spaces to breathe freely. The Habsburg, with its maze of corridors and omnipresent courtiers, offered no such respite. Despite Xavier's warnings, she encountered the emperor twice more before the move, once during a court concert, where he sought her opinion on the performance, and once in the palace library, where he discovered her reading a history of the Habsburg domains. You take an interest in our empire's past, Franz Josef observed, selecting a volume from a nearby shelf. To understand the present, one must study the past, Florence replied, careful to keep her tone respectfully neutral. A wise approach, the emperor said, one I wish more of my advisors would adopt. He glanced at the book in her hands. That particular volume takes a rather charitable view of Habsburg rule in Bohemia. Florence couldn't help but smile at the understatement. Indeed, Your Majesty, I was comparing it with my own knowledge of Bohemian history, and finding discrepancies, no doubt, Franz Josef said with surprising candor. History is written by the victorious, they say, or by those who pay the historians, Florence added, then immediately worried she had overstepped. But the emperor merely nodded, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Precisely so, Lady Zima. He placed the book he had been examining back on the shelf. I find your perspective refreshing. Too many at court tell me only what they think I wish to hear. That must make it difficult to govern effectively, Florence observed. More than you know, the emperor said, his voice suddenly weary. A ruler surrounded only by echoes of his own thoughts is doomed to failure. Their conversation continued briefly before the emperor was called away to attend to state business. As he left, he turned back to Florence with an unexpected request. I would appreciate your thoughts on a matter concerning Bohemia. Perhaps you might join me for tea tomorrow? Informally, of course. Florence's heart raced as she cursed and accepted, knowing as she did that the informal tea would be noted by every eye at court. As she watched the emperor depart, she caught sight of Xavier in the doorway, his expression dark with concern. She found him waiting for her as she left the library, his tall figure positioned casually in an alcove as if by chance. You've been invited to tea, he said without preamble, falling into step beside her as she walked toward her quarters. News travels quickly, Florence observed. It's my business to know what happens around the emperor, Xavier replied. His voice was tight, controlled. This is exactly what I warned you about. I could hardly refuse an imperial invitation, Florence pointed out. No, you couldn't, Xavier conceded. He guided her toward a window embrasure where they could speak with some privacy. But you must understand what this means. Every eye at court will be watching you now. Every faction will be assessing whether you represent an opportunity or a threat. Florence met his gaze steadily. And how do you assess me, Mr. Dankworth? Am I opportunity or threat? Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, an emotion quickly suppressed. You are a complication, he said finally. To the emperor's marriage prospects? Florence asked. To everything, Xavier replied. The word held a weight that suggested he meant more than just court politics. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Florence felt the tension between them, a current that had been building since their first meeting in the library months ago. I never asked for his attention, she said softly. Few do, Xavier replied. But once given, it cannot be ignored or refused. He stepped back, creating distance between them. Be careful tomorrow. The emperor values your candor, but there are limits to what even he can tolerate in terms of criticism of Habsburg policies. I understand, Florence said. Thank you for your concern. Xavier bowed slightly. It is my duty to ensure the smooth functioning of the imperial household. The formality of his words stung, though Florence knew it was necessary. Whatever existed between them, this undefined tension, this careful dance of attraction and restraint, could never be acknowledged openly. Not while she remained under the emperor's interest. Not while Xavier served as his closest advisor. The tea with Emperor Franz Josef took place in a small salon overlooking the Schönbrunn Gardens. Though termed informal, it still adhered to strict protocol. Servants stood at attention, a lady-in-waiting sat at a discreet distance, and the conversation remained carefully within the bounds of propriety. I value your insight into Bohemian matters, the emperor said as he gestured for her cup to be refilled. My advisors provide reports, of course, but they lack the personal understanding that you possess. I'm honored by your majesty's confidence, Florence replied cautiously. Though I must admit my perspective is limited to my family's experience. Sometimes a single perspective, honestly shared, is worth more than a dozen diplomatic dispatches, Franz Josef said. He dismissed the servants with a gesture, leaving only the lady-in-waiting as chaperone. Tell me, what do your countrymen truly think of Habsburg rule? Not what they say in public declarations, but what they say among themselves. It was a dangerous question, one that could easily become a trap. Florence chose her words with care. They desire recognition, Your Majesty, not merely as subjects of the empire, but as a people with their own history, language, and traditions. Recognition, the emperor repeated thoughtfully, not independence. Some dream of independence, yes, Florence admitted. But most understand the practical benefits of belonging to a greater empire. What they chafe against is not Habsburg rule itself, but the perception that their identity is being subsumed. Franz Josef nodded slowly. A more nuanced view than I usually hear. He set down his cup. And what of the language decrees? My ministers insist that German must remain the administrative language throughout the empire. Language is the soul of a people, Your Majesty, Florence said, venturing into increasingly dangerous territory. When you tell Bohemians they cannot conduct official business in Czech, you tell them their soul has no place in your empire. She had gone too far. She could see it in the slight stiffening of the emperor's posture. But to her surprise, he did not display anger. You speak boldly, Lady Zima, he said. Few at court would dare to be so direct. Forgive me if I have offended, Your Majesty. On the contrary, Franz Josef said, your honesty is refreshing. He looked at her thoughtfully. Perhaps there is wisdom in what you say. A language policy that alienates loyal subjects serves no one's interests, least of all the crown's. The conversation continued, touching on various aspects of Bohemian culture and politics. As it drew to a close, the emperor made a request that sent a chill down Florence's spine. I would value your continued insights, he said. Perhaps you might join my advisory circle on matters relating to the Bohemian provinces. It was an extraordinary honor and an extraordinary danger. Such a position would place her at the center of court politics, make her a target for those who opposed any concessions to the empire's constituent nations. Your Majesty honors me beyond my deserving, Florence said carefully. But I fear I lack the diplomatic training such a role would require. Diplomats I have in abundance, Franz Josef replied with a rare smile. What I lack are honest voices willing to speak uncomfortable truths. He rose, signaling the end of their meeting. Consider it, at least. We shall speak again soon. As Florence left the salon, she found Xavier waiting in the corridor, ostensibly reviewing documents, but clearly positioned to intercept her. Well, he asked quietly as they walked together, maintaining a proper distance. He wishes me to advise him on Bohemian matters, Florence said, still processing the implications herself. Xavier's steps faltered momentarily. This is unexpected and unwelcome, judging by your expression, Florence observed. Xavier guided her toward a less trafficked corridor. It places you in an impossible position, he said, his voice low and urgent. Court factions will see you either as a threat to be eliminated or a tool to be used. Your family in Bohemia will face scrutiny from both imperial officials and revolutionary elements. And the emperor? What about the emperor? Florence prompted when he hesitated. Xavier's expression was troubled. His interest in you may not be entirely political. The implication hung in the air between them. Florence felt her cheeks warm despite herself. That's absurd, she said. He is the Emperor of Austria. I am merely a provincial countess. A beautiful, intelligent provincial countess who speaks to him with a honesty no one else dares, Xavier corrected. I know Franz Josef. I have served him since his ascension. He values duty above all else. But he is still a young man, and you. He stopped, seeming to realize he had said too much. And I? Florence pressed, stepping closer to him than propriety strictly allowed. Xavier's gaze met hers, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore at court slipped. You are unlike anyone at court, he said softly. You see beyond titles and power to the people beneath them. You speak truth regardless of consequence. He broke off, visibly composing himself. The emperor notices these qualities, as do others. The unspoken hung between them, that Xavier himself had noticed, had been drawn to her for the same reasons. What should I do? Florence asked. Accept the position, Xavier said after a moment's consideration. Refusing would raise questions, perhaps even suspicions. But be careful. Speak honestly, but diplomatically. And, he hesitated, perhaps it would be wise to mention your attachment to another. Florence raised an eyebrow. My attachment? I have no attachment. The court need not know that, Xavier said. A fictional understanding with a nobleman back in Bohemia might provide some protection against certain complications. You're suggesting I lie to the emperor? I'm suggesting you create a boundary, Xavier corrected. One that allows you to serve as advisor without inviting more personal interest. Florence considered this. And you think the emperor would respect such a boundary? Franz Josef values duty above all else, Xavier said. If he believes your heart is promised elsewhere, his own sense of honor would prevent him from pursuing any deeper attachment. What remained unspoken was the question of Xavier's own feelings, whether he, too, would be bound by such honor if he believed her heart belonged to another. The court's return to the Habsburg coincided with preparations for the emperor's birthday celebrations in August. Florence found herself increasingly drawn into the inner circles of the court as she cautiously assumed the advisory role the emperor had offered. She followed Xavier's advice, inventing a childhood understanding with a fictional count's son from a neighboring estate in Bohemia. The fabrication seemed to have the desired effect. The emperor continued to seek her counsel on matters relating to Bohemia, but their interactions remained properly formal. If he felt any disappointment at the news of her attachment, he concealed it well behind the mask of imperial dignity. What Florence had not anticipated was how the lie would affect her growing connection with Xavier. Their conversations, once flowing freely in the library at Schönbrunn, became more guarded, more formal. He maintained a careful distance, both physical and emotional, that left her feeling strangely bereft. You've become quite the court favorite, he observed one afternoon as they reviewed a translation of a Bohemian petition before it was presented to the emperor. They sat in a small antechamber off the main imperial offices, a proper distance between them, a secretary working in the corner to ensure propriety. Hardly a favorite, Florence replied. Merely useful in a specific capacity. Xavier made a non-committal sound as he marked a correction on the document. The Hungarian delegation seems particularly interested in your influence. Count Andrusy has requested your presence at their salon next week. Florence detected an unfamiliar note in his voice. Was it jealousy? Concern? Is that unwise? She asked. It's politically complex, Xavier replied carefully. The Hungarians seek similar concessions to those you've advocated for Bohemia. Your presence at their gathering could be interpreted as support for their position. And is that not consistent with my beliefs? Equal recognition for all nations within the empire. Xavier glanced toward the secretary, then lowered his voice. Politics is rarely about consistency, Lady Zima. It's about timing and perception. The Hungarian question is particularly delicate at present. Florence studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful neutrality of his expression. You're not telling me everything. This isn't the place, Xavier said, his eyes flicking meaningfully toward the secretary. Later that evening, Florence received a small folded note slipped beneath her door. Asterisk the Spanish riding school. Dawn tomorrow. Come alone. Asterisk the Spanish riding school was empty in the early morning hours, the famous Lipizzaner stallions still in their stables. Florence found Xavier waiting in the center of the sand-covered performance ring, the rising sun casting long shadows through the high windows. "This is becoming a habit," she said as she approached him, her footsteps muffled by the sand. "Secret meetings in increasingly unusual locations. Places where we won't be overheard," Xavier corrected. He looked tired, she thought, the strain of his position evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "Why such secrecy about a Hungarian salon?" Florence asked. Xavier ran a hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. "Because there's more at stake than you realize. The Hungarians aren't simply seeking recognition like the Bohemians. They're pushing for a complete restructuring of the empire, a dual monarchy with equal power shared between Austria and Hungary. And the emperor opposes this. He's considering it," Xavier said, "against the advice of many of his ministers. The empire is still fragile after the revolutions. Such a fundamental change could either strengthen it by appeasing Hungarian nationalism or weaken it by encouraging similar demands from every province." Florence absorbed this, including Bohemia. "Exactly," Xavier confirmed. "Which is why your presence at the Hungarian salon would be seen as significant. You've become something of a symbol, Florence, a voice for Bohemian interests at court who has the emperor's ear." The use of her given name didn't escape her notice. In their private meetings, the formality between them had gradually eroded. If the emperor is truly considering a dual monarchy, then perhaps similar arrangements could be made for Bohemia and other nations within the empire, Florence suggested. A federation rather than a centralized state. Xavier's expression was unreadable. "You sound like a revolutionary." "I sound like someone who wants the empire to survive," Florence countered. "Suppression of national identities is what fueled the revolutions in the first place." "Perhaps," Xavier conceded. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice despite the empty hall. "But that's not the only reason I wanted to speak with you. There are rumors at court about your influence with the emperor." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "Rumors? That your attachment in Bohemia is convenient fiction," Xavier said. "That your true ambition is to become more than just an advisor to Franz Josef." The implication hung in the air between them. "That's absurd," Florence said, echoing her words from their earlier conversation about the emperor's interest. "I created that fiction on your advice, to establish boundaries." "I know," Xavier said, "but court gossip rarely concerns itself with truth." Florence studied him, suddenly understanding. "You're not worried about the rumors. You're worried they might reach the emperor." Xavier's silence was confirmation enough. "Why?" Florence pressed, stepping closer to him. "Why does it matter to you what the emperor believes about my personal attachments?" The question hung between them, charged with all the unspoken feelings that had grown over the months of their acquaintance. Xavier's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "Because he began, then stopped abruptly as the distant sound of doors opening echoed through the hall. They stepped apart quickly as a groom entered at the far end of the arena, leading one of the white stallions for an early morning exercise. The moment was broken, the confession unfinished. "We should return to the palace separately," Xavier said, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Consider carefully before accepting the Hungarian invitation. There are currents at work that go deeper than you know." As autumn deepened toward winter, the political situation within the empire grew increasingly complex. Negotiations with the Hungarians progressed in secret, while other national groups, Bohemians, Poles, Croatians, watched closely for signs of how they might be affected by any restructuring. Florence maintained her position as advisor on Bohemian affairs, carefully navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. She declined the Hungarian salon invitation, following Xavier's implicit warning, but continued to advocate for greater recognition of Bohemian language and cultural rights in her meetings with the emperor. Her relationship with Xavier evolved into something neither of them acknowledged openly, a partnership of sorts, a careful alliance within the competitive environment of the court. They met regularly to discuss matters of state, their conversations gradually extending beyond politics to more personal territories. His childhood in England, her life in Bohemia, their shared love of literature and music. What remained unspoken was the growing attraction between them, evident in lingering glances, in hands that brushed accidentally when passing documents, in conversations that continued long after their official business had concluded. "You've never asked me why I left England," Xavier said one evening as they walked through the Imperial Portrait Gallery, ostensibly discussing arrangements for an upcoming diplomatic reception. "I assumed it was for professional advancement," Florence replied. "The Habsburg court offers opportunities that might be closed to a second son in England." Xavier smiled slightly, perceptive as always. "But that's only part of the truth." He paused before a portrait of a past emperor. "My father had arranged a marriage for me, an advantageous alliance with a wealthy industrial family. Not quite aristocracy, but rich enough that the connection would benefit our family estates." "And you objected to the match?" Florence guessed. "I objected to having my life determined for me," Xavier said. "To being a piece moved on my father's chessboard." He glanced at her. "Perhaps not unlike your feelings about being sent here as a sacrifice." The parallel wasn't lost on Florence. "So you fled to Vienna." "I came to Vienna to make my own way," he corrected, "and found myself serving an emperor not much younger than myself, helping him navigate a political landscape neither of us was fully prepared for." He turned to face her fully. "Franz Josef didn't choose his role any more than you chose yours. He was thrust into power by circumstance, by the abdication of his uncle, by the needs of an empire in crisis." "You care for him," Florence observed. "Not just as your emperor, but as a person." "I do," Xavier admitted. "Which is why—" He hesitated, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Which is why I find myself in an increasingly difficult position regarding you." Florence's heart quickened. "Regarding me?" Xavier's gray eyes held hers. "The emperor values your counsel. He speaks of you often, with an admiration that goes beyond your political insights." "I've maintained all proper boundaries," Florence said, understanding his implication. "I've never encouraged any personal interest." "I know," Xavier said, "but feelings develop regardless of encouragement." He looked away, particularly when the person in question possesses both beauty and intelligence in equal measure. The compliment hung in the air between them, its recipient ambiguous. Was he speaking of the emperor's admiration or his own? Before Florence could respond, they were interrupted by a palace functionary delivering an urgent message for Xavier. The moment passed, the conversation never resumed. As winter settled over Vienna, bringing snow and early darkness, the political climate within the empire reached a critical point. Negotiations with the Hungarian delegation had progressed to the stage where a formal restructuring of the empire seemed imminent. A dual monarchy that would grant Hungary equal status with Austria while maintaining a single ruler. Florence found herself increasingly caught between competing interests. The Bohemian nobility, learning of her position at court, sent a flood of petitions and letters demanding similar concessions for their province. The conservative faction at court viewed her with suspicion, seeing in her a dangerous influence pushing the emperor toward concessions they opposed. And the emperor himself continued to seek her counsel, valuing her perspective even when it challenged Habsburg traditions. It was Xavier who warned her of the growing danger. "You're becoming too visible," he said during one of their now regular evening walks through the less frequented corridors of the Hofburg. "Count von Grun has begun questioning your presence in advisory meetings." Count von Grun was the emperor's adjutant general, a conservative military man who viewed any concession to national sentiments as weakness. "The emperor invited my participation," Florence pointed out. "The emperor is young," Xavier countered. "Von Grun and his faction believe he is being misled by advisors who don't understand the military realities of the empire." Florence stopped walking, turning to face him. "Do they include you in that assessment?" Xavier's expression tightened. "Increasingly, yes. My support for the Hungarian compromise has not gone unnoticed." He lowered his voice. "There have been suggestions that my judgment may be clouded by personal considerations." "Personal considerations," Florence repeated. "You mean me?" "I mean that our association has been noted," Xavier said carefully, "as has the emperor's regard for you." Florence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter drafts in the palace corridors. "Are you suggesting that I withdraw from court? Return to Bohemia?" "No," Xavier said quickly, too quickly, revealing more than he perhaps intended. "But I am suggesting caution. The negotiations with Hungary are at a delicate stage. Once they are concluded, the political landscape will shift. Until then, I should make myself less visible," Florence finished for him. She studied his face, noting the concern in his eyes. "You're worried for me." "I'm worried for us all," Xavier replied. "The empire stands at a crossroads. The decisions made in the coming weeks will shape its future for generations." What he didn't say, what hung unspoken between them, was how their own futures might be shaped by those same decisions. The crisis came more suddenly than either of them anticipated. On a bitter January morning in 1867, Florence was summoned to the emperor's private study, an unprecedented honor that immediately set court tongues wagging. She found Franz Josef standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered gardens, his young face grave. "Lady Zima," he said as she curtsied, "thank you for coming." "Your Majesty honors me," Florence replied, noting with concern the strain evident in his features. "I have reached a decision regarding Hungary," the emperor said without preamble. "The empire will be restructured as a dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary will be equal partners, with separate parliaments and ministries, united under a single crown." Florence absorbed this momentous news. "A wise decision, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "One that recognizes political realities while preserving the essential unity of the empire." Franz Josef turned from the window to face her fully. "That is not why I summoned you. The Hungarian question is decided. It is the Bohemian question that now concerns me." Florence's pulse quickened. "Bohemian question, Your Majesty? Your countrymen will not be satisfied with the Hungarian settlement," the emperor said. "They will demand similar concessions. Already, petitions are arriving from Prague." He gestured to a stack of documents on his desk. "Many reference you, Lady Zima. Your influence at court. Your special relationship with the crown." The implication was clear and dangerous. "I have never encouraged such perceptions, Your Majesty," Florence said carefully. "My role has been solely advisory, at your request." "I know," Franz Josef said, his voice softening slightly. "You have served with integrity. But perception often matters more than reality in politics." He moved to his desk, picking up a sealed letter. "Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting." He handed her the letter, its heavy imperial seal intact. "I am sending you back to Bohemia." Florence felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. "Your Majesty?" "Not in disgrace," the emperor clarified quickly. "On the contrary, this letter appoints you as my special envoy to Prague. You will carry my personal assurances to the Bohemian Diet that their concerns will be addressed after the Hungarian settlement is implemented." Relief mingled with confusion. I am honored by Your Majesty's trust." "There is another reason," Franz Josef continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Your presence at court has become complicated. There are rumors that I have sought to influence Your Majesty inappropriately." Florence completed for him, her cheeks warming with indignation. "Among other things," the emperor confirmed. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than protocol dictated. "Some rumors contain kernels of truth, Lady Zima. Had circumstances been different." He left the thought unfinished, but his meaning was clear enough. "When am I to depart?" Florence asked, steering the conversation back to safer ground. "Tomorrow," Franz Josef said. "Arrangements have been made. You will travel with a full imperial escort, a visible sign of my favor to reassure both your countrymen and those at court who have questioned your role." Tomorrow. So soon. The word echoed in Florence's mind as she realized what it meant. No time to properly say goodbye. No chance to speak with Xavier one last time. As if reading her thoughts, the emperor added, "Mr. Dankworth has been informed of your mission. He prepared the necessary documents." He hesitated, then added, "He requested permission to accompany your escort as far as the Bohemian border, citing diplomatic protocol. I have granted his request." Florence struggled to keep her expression neutral despite the surge of emotion the emperor's words provoked. "That is most considerate, Your Majesty." Franz Josef studied her for a moment longer. "He is a good man, Dankworth. Loyal. Intelligent." A faint smile touched his lips. "And perhaps more perceptive about certain matters than I initially gave him credit for." Before Florence could decipher this cryptic comment, the emperor moved toward the door, signaling the end of their audience. "The empire owes you a debt of gratitude, Lady Zima. As do I personally. I hope your mission to Prague is successful, and that you will return to Vienna when circumstances permit." With that, she was dismissed, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. The journey to Prague began in the pre-dawn darkness of the following day. Florence found herself in an imperial carriage, surrounded by the trappings of a diplomatic mission, outriders, guards, the Habsburg standard fluttering in the winter wind. Across from her sat Xavier Dankworth, his face illuminated by the swaying lantern that hung from the carriage ceiling. They traveled in silence until the city was well behind them, both acutely aware of the imperial guards riding alongside. Only when they stopped to change horses at a posting station did they find a moment of relative privacy as they walked briefly in the inn's garden to stretch their legs after hours of travel. "This is not how I imagined saying goodbye," Florence said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Nor I," Xavier admitted. He glanced toward the guards, maintaining a discreet distance but still watchful. The emperor's decision was sudden, though not unexpected. The Hungarian negotiations have reached a critical phase, and your presence at court had become politically complicated. "So I gathered," Florence said, "though I suspect there were personal complications as well." Xavier's gaze met hers. "The emperor holds you in high regard, and yet he sends me away." "He sends you where you can do the most good," Xavier corrected. "Both for the empire and for yourself." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "and perhaps for other reasons that he did not explicitly acknowledge." Florence studied him. "What do you mean?" Xavier took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Franz Josef is more perceptive than many give him credit for. He sees the connections between people, the currents that run beneath the surface of court interactions. He saw us," Florence realized. "Whatever this is between us." "I believe so," Xavier confirmed. "His comment to me when he approved my request to accompany you was telling." "What did he say?" "He said that sometimes duty and desire need not be opposing forces," Xavier replied. "That a ruler must sometimes sacrifice personal happiness for the greater good, but that he would not demand the same sacrifice from those who serve him loyally." Florence absorbed this, understanding its implications. "He gave you permission." "Not explicitly," Xavier said. "Such things are never stated directly. But he made it clear that my future path is mine to determine once this mission is complete." The call came for them to return to the carriage. As they walked back, Xavier spoke quickly, urgently. "I requested assignment to the Imperial Embassy in Prague," he said. "The Emperor has taken it under consideration." Hope bloomed in Florence's chest despite the uncertainty. "When will you know?" "Soon," Xavier promised. "After the Hungarian settlement is finalized." They reached the carriage, where protocol reasserted itself in the presence of the guards. As Xavier handed her up into the vehicle, their fingers touched briefly, a small contact that carried the weight of all they could not yet say openly. The journey to Prague took 4 days, through snow-covered landscapes and small towns where their imperial procession caused a stir of excitement and speculation. Florence and Xavier maintained proper decorum throughout, their conversations restricted to diplomatic matters when others were present. But in the brief moments of privacy afforded by in gardens, church visits, and carriage rides on empty stretches of road, they spoke more freely. "What will you do in Prague?" Xavier asked on the 3rd evening, as they stood in the shelter of a small chapel where they had stopped to rest. "Deliver the emperor's message," Florence replied. "Assure the Bohemian Diet that their concerns have not been forgotten, that concessions similar to Hungary's may be possible in time." "And after?" Florence looked out at the snowy landscape, the distant mountains of her homeland visible on the horizon. "Return to my family's estate, I suppose. Resume the life I left behind when I was sent to Vienna. Is that what you want?" Xavier asked, his voice soft but intent. Florence turned to face him. "What I want has rarely been considered in the calculations that have determined my path." "Consider it now," Xavier said. "If you could choose your future, what would it be?" It was a dangerous question, laden with implications neither of them had fully voiced. Florence held his gaze, finding courage in the emotion she saw reflected there. "I would choose a life where duty and desire are not opposing forces," she said, echoing the emperor's words. "Where sacrifice is not demanded without purpose or end." "And where would such a life be lived?" Xavier pressed. "In Prague? Vienna? Elsewhere? The location matters less than the company," Florence replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold chapel. "Florence," a guard's cough from the doorway interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Their moment of privacy was ended. The journey resumed. On the final day, as they approached the Bohemian border where Xavier would turn back toward Vienna, a snowstorm descended, forcing their carriage to seek shelter at a small hunting lodge belonging to the imperial estates. The unexpected delay granted them one last evening together, away from the immediate pressures of court politics. In the lodge's small library, with a fire blazing against the winter chill and the storm howling outside, they found themselves truly alone for the first time since leaving Vienna. The guards and attendants were quartered in a separate wing, the lodge's caretaker occupied with preparations for the night. Strange how circumstances conspire, Xavier observed as he stood by the fire, watching the flames dance. A snowstorm grants us what imperial protocol denied, a proper goodbye. Florence moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the heat of the fire and of his presence. Is this goodbye, then? Or something else? Xavier turned to her, his customary reserve finally falling away. That depends on what you want it to be. I told you what I want, Florence reminded him. A life where duty and desire need not be opposing forces. And I want to be part of that life, Xavier said, the words coming in a rush after months of careful restraint. I have since that first day in the library, when you challenged me with your honesty and your courage. He reached for her hand, a gesture that crossed the final boundary between them. I requested the Prague assignment not just because it would advance my career, but because it would bring me to you. If you'll have me. Florence laced her fingers with his. The court would disapprove. The emperor's private secretary abandoning Vienna for Prague, for a woman once rumored to have caught the imperial eye. The emperor already understands, Xavier said. And as for the court, he smiled slightly. I've spent years navigating its politics. I can manage this final negotiation. And what are the terms of this negotiation? Florence asked, her heart pounding as he drew her closer. Simply this, Xavier said softly, that you were sent to the palace as a sacrifice, but instead found a path to something neither of us expected to discover amid the intrigues of the Habsburg court. And what was that? Florence whispered, though she already knew the answer. Love, Xavier said simply. Unexpected, inconvenient, politically complicated love. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silent white, Florence Zima and Xavier Dankworth sealed their private treaty with a kiss that had been months in the making. A kiss that promised a future where duty and desire might, against all odds, find themselves aligned. 3 months later, as spring began to transform the Bohemian countryside, Florence received an imperial dispatch. The Hungarian Compromise had been formally ratified, creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Enclosed with the official announcement was a private letter from Emperor Franz Josef, confirming Xavier Dankworth's appointment as diplomatic liaison to the Bohemian Diet, a position that would keep him in Prague indefinitely. A second, smaller envelope contained a note in Xavier's familiar handwriting. My dearest Florence, asterisk by the time you receive this, I will be en route to Prague. The Emperor has granted my request, with his personal blessing. He asked me to convey a message to you. Tell Lady Zima that some sacrifices lead to unexpected blessings, both for those who make them and those who receive them. Asterisk, I believe he was speaking of us both, with love and anticipation. Xavier. When Xavier Dankworth arrived in Prague a week later, Florence Zima was waiting for him on the platform of the newly built railway station. As they walked together through the ancient streets of the Bohemian capital, their future stretched before them. A future where what had begun as a sacrifice had transformed into something neither of them could have anticipated, a love that had become the unexpected weakness of an emperor, and in that weakness, the foundation of their strength.